Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me for my AMAP Friday. Today we're going to, I'm going to be discussing, the question was, how did Joe Pilates teach stretching? So there'll be some interesting things about that I think that most people will want to do. Hi, Alexandra. Nice to see you. Hey, Patty. All right, so did Joe teach stretching? Yes, he did. Do we know how? Well, when we talk about stretching, there's a couple things we have to think about first, right? Which is, what are we stretching, right? Are we stretching the muscles? Are we stretching the myofascia? Are we stretching the fascia, the muscles? Are we stretching the nerves? There's nerve stretching. There's lots of different things that we can stretch in the body, right? The organs, the connective tissues, a lot of different things. We know that if you look at Joe's videos and we look at and listen to his voice and we look at his writings, he was much more of a dynamic stretch person, meaning that there's dynamic where you stretch and you hold it for a very short period of time. So it's a stretch and move and stretch and move. Or there's the static stretch where you put it in a position and you just wait for, most places talk about 30 seconds to a minute. I do it a little bit longer when my PT, depending on what it is I'm trying to work on. And again, it depends on the structure and what it is you're trying to affect with stretching, right? And so when we look at what Joe is trying to affect, he's trying to affect the myofascial, the muscular system, and it's a system, it's an organ. The muscles are an organ. They have a specific function in the body. And his was dynamic. So it was not, it was, stretch and release and stretch and release. So it's almost a bounce, but not really a bounce. At least it doesn't seem that way. And so, and when you stretch that way, what are you doing? You're straining the tissues a little bit. You're also giving information into the nervous system a little bit. And when you do that consistently, that over time, you will start to see changes in the structure of the tissue. But that's one way to do it. Then there's static stretching, which he didn't do, at least not that I've seen. I mean, he had rest positions, so he'd have you rest afterwards, which technically might, depending on the position you're resting in, might apply a stretch to certain tissues. But it wasn't really his purpose, what he was trying to do. Okay. I'll talk about that in a little bit. So, a perfect example is, like single leg stretch, right? You inhale to come up, you exhale, come down around. And then when you inhale, you come all the way up and you give it a stretch. And then you exhale, you go down around, you inhale, give it a stretch. So that's one way of thinking about his dynamicness. Spine stretch forward. You go forward, and then you stretch farther, and you stretch farther, right? When you do side kicks, better, best, right? So you stretch a little farther each time, try to go a little bit better than you did the time before. So you're always pushing the envelope, and when you push that envelope, you push the stretch. So that's what he was always trying to do. And obviously, it does work, okay, over time. Again, it takes time to do that. When you have an injury, though, you have to be very careful, because if you do dynamic stretching with an injury, you can keep kind of irritating the injury. And if you do static stretching, you can do the same thing if you take it too far and leave it too long. So, with injury, you have to let things heal. But a lot of times when you have an injury and things heal, there is adhesions, connective tissue and just tissues, adhesions, because when tissues tear, they repair, but they don't, if your organization is like this and you tear something, it doesn't go back like this. It goes back and it's a little gnarly and it's messed up and it's scar tissue. And scar tissue tends to be stronger than the original tissue. So most often, if you restrain the area of where you have scar tissue, the scar tissue doesn't tear. Usually the tissues right above it, below it, behind it, in front of it, next to it tend to tear more often and easier, because they are not as strong as the scar tissue because of the way the scar tissue maturates and heals. So those are the things to think about. But when we talk about stretching, I look at it as what are you trying to affect, right? And what's making the change? So when you do a dynamic stretch, you are not you're sort of getting past the physiology, right? Which is basically there are Golgi tendon organs, there's spindles in the muscles, and they're designed to react to certain movements and functions. And if you do things fast enough, but not too slow, not too fast, you can get past some of the responses before they kick in, so you can get some changes. If it's consistent, then you'll get those changes. And that's kind of what Joe did, right? Because if you do a more of a static stretch, and you go to a place where you feel stretch and it becomes uncomfortable. Well, then what happens when it's uncomfortable? You tend to then counterbalance, and that's the nervous system trying to protect itself, right? Because it feels discomfort, and which eventually may be pain or something else. And so a lot of times when people do static stretching, they'll stay, hold it for 30 seconds to, maybe 90. And when you're doing that, you're affecting certain things, but you don't really get the change. And so one of the things that I do in my teaching, and I've been influenced by many people, right? There's Janda, there's Carl Lewitt, there's different people, David Butler for the neural stretching, and I've studied with all these people, again, the source of a lot of that way of thinking, or some of the sources at least. And when we're looking at stretching, if we're trying to affect the nervous system, it needs time to do what? It needs time to have a discussion, basically with everything else, right? Because there's no muscle or area of the body that works by itself. Everything is interrelated and interconnected. So if you're trying to change a function in one part, all the other parts kind of have to agree. And so what I have found over time is that the more time you have, the more information is facilitated, and the more communication happens in the nervous system, and it finds the answer, and then it lets go, right? And so if you still feel the stretch, then you've stretched it, but you haven't released it, and you haven't really changed it. So you really have to wait for that to change. If you're doing a static type of stretch and you're really trying to affect the neural input and make sure that there's enough time for everybody to, it's kind of like good democracy. Everybody, you go back and forth, you have your disagreements, your arguments, you go, back and forth, but eventually you agree on something, and then, and change happens, right? Doesn't really happen at least in the U.S. anymore. But that's what democracy is, and the nervous system is like that. It's sort of everybody has to, get on board to a certain degree and agree with that. And if you have too much disagreement, then you don't get anywhere, and you don't get a lot of change. So there's my politics. So in the nervous system, if we wait long enough, and usually, and again, I usually say it's 1.5 to 2 minutes. It could be longer, depending on how long somebody's had a problem and an issue. But if you're going a stretch and you hold that stretch for a period of time, and you no longer feel the stretch, what's happened? Right? It's changed, and we need that change. So that's more of a static stretch, and that's not Pilates. That's not what Joe did. And a good example. Let me see. Where's a good place to do it? So if you look at on the ladder barrel, and you're doing a ballet stretch, and you bring your leg up onto the ladder barrel, and you have two choices, right? You can stretch the hamstring, the muscles in the back of your leg. And where do they attach? They attach to the tibia and the fibula, and they attach to the ischial tuberosity on the pelvis. But they do more. If you look at new textbooks, they say the attachment is on the ischial tuberosity. But when you look at the old textbooks and when they do the dissection, you can really see that that's where the tendon tends to attach. But the tendon has connections into the ligaments and the ligamentous tissue in the pelvis and into the sacrum, so it really doesn't just stop. It's sort of, those tissues are interconnected all the way up through the pelvis and into the lumbar fascia. So there's all these connections. So if you want to stretch the posterior aspect of your leg, the hamstring muscles, if you keep your back straight and you bend forward, then you're stretching what? You're stretching the hamstring, because that's, it doesn't really go much past it. It might go up into the pelvis, but it doesn't go into the, all the way. I mean, everything's interconnected, but as far as the structural tissues, they don't go that far. There's only one thing that goes from your head to the tips of your fingers and the tips of your toes, and that's your nerve, right? So when you talk about stretching, if you just keep the spine straight and you stretch at the pelvis, then you're stretching more of the muscle itself, that particular muscle. If you then bend your spine, then what are you doing? You're also stretching the nervous system, right? And then what's your foot doing? If your foot points, then it doesn't stretch as much, because it's the nerve, that's the sciatic nerve, going in the posterior aspect, not the anterior, right? And so if you flex the foot and then you stretch the leg and then you stretch the spine, you're really stretching the nerve all the way. So in Pilates, there's a lot of stretches or movements or functions that we do that also tend to stretch the nerve as well. When we look at the way Mr. Butler put it together for the neural stretching, and the way he did it, it was like, what goes from the tip to the head, and how do you stretch that all the way? And there's posterior, there's anterior, there's different ways to do that. So those are the things that we do. And when we look at Pilates and the way Mr. Pilates integrated his system and his movements, there is, full extension, there's full flexion, and, and it's not just one aspect, one joint, it's all the way up the chain. So it's there, but it's much more dynamic, and it's not so static. And again, what are you trying to do? If you have, since the nerve travels and it has a pathway all the way from where it exits the spine, the peripheral nerves exit the spine and goes into the extremities, or wherever else it goes, into the ribs and the torso. But let's just talk about extremities. If it goes into the extremities, it has a pathway. So if you have any kind of damage, injury, or problem anywhere in between, you can have changes in the tissue, scar tissue, adhesions, things that from inactivity, from misuse or disuse or change of use. And any and all those can happen in relationship to an injury, especially if it's very traumatic, if it's very painful. And if you hold something long enough, it becomes habituated. So that's the other issue that we have to deal with. So we're not only changing the movement patterns back to a more organic, functional relationship in Pilates, but we're also taking that movement and we're constantly doing what? We're going back and forth, which is like they call one of the things you can do is it's a sheath, right? So you're gliding the sheath, and you're making sure that it has the ability to glide. Within, the nerve can glide in relationship to all the tissues around it. Well, we do that in Pilates as well. So there's a little bit of that going on. Mr. Butler and the people who've done all the neural stretching, that's much more specific, just trying to focus on the nerve, to a certain degree, and then, integrating that into the functional of the movement. But Mr. Pilates, it was already it's built into his system that way. So it's already happening. But again, his is much more dynamic. When you have scar tissue, if you do it consistently over time, you can change it. But if you do it statically, what's required to change? If you have a change in stretching that happens in 30 seconds, trust me, it's not the fascia. The fascia doesn't change that quickly. It just doesn't. I've not seen it where it's able to change and stay that way, because if it was, scar tissues would not be scar tissues, and they would happen, and you would be able to move it a little bit and it would change right away, and it doesn't. It takes very long. I can tell you clinically, working with post-surgical patients and scars for 40 some years, if you try to move the scar too soon, guess what? It opens up. So you have to let it heal, and you have to let that tissue mature. Otherwise, you start to, you get a wider and wider scar and you break the tissue, and you can't do, shouldn't be doing that, because that's not necessarily beneficial. So you have to let that scar heal and mature. Once it does, that means it's, again, it's not this nice congruent tissue anymore. It's all bound down. Now, over time, with manual therapy, hands-on, pushing and stretching, and trying to reformat that tissue, and with, dynamic and static stretching, depending on what you're doing, because in life you need stability and mobility, so we need to kind of do both of those things. Mr. Pilates didn't really do static, he did dynamic. But if you do dynamic, over time it will make changes as well. So I think, and remember, Mr. Pilates said he wasn't a doctor, he wasn't a therapist. He was, he was there to help people exercise, and contrology was about, gaining the habits that allowed you to function in life very well. If you have an injury, you may have to do things differently. And that's why I always say that Pilates teachers should find good PTs and MDs that do, musculoskeletal, that type of work, or osteopaths, because they're the ones who can go and do the manual work and facilitate the changes when there's those injuries. And then Pilates helps facilitate that and maintain that, and make that the new habit, right? The movement, and changing the old habits of relationship to injury and pain and everything else. So those are some of the things that I think that when we talk about, stretching, because yes, Mr. Pilates did not do that I've seen in the archives, really static stretching. It was much more dynamic, and it was almost a bounce, but not. And, there was a time where that's what everybody did. You saw, they talked about in the literature and in the textbooks and exercise books and things like that, about bouncing. And then that became, when they looked at the Golgi tendon organ and they looked at the muscle spindle, and they're saying, oh, we shouldn't really do that. And so, but Mr. Pilates didn't do a full bounce. He did it in a different way, right? So he did it slightly differently. So it wasn't a bounce, but it was still dynamic. And that's really what's the change. And I think, when you're looking at movement and exercise, makes the most sense, all right? But again, I studied with Mr. Iyengar in India, and my first day there, it was like yoga boot camp. I mean, holding these asana positions for minutes or longer. It was like, oh my God. But then guess what happens? After a minute or two or three, all of a sudden it relaxes and allows you to, find that new position and do what you need to do. So those are the things that you also have to realize that can happen. So there are benefits in both of those. And, Mr. Iyengar was he was the contemporary. He added all the props and all these other things, where if you look at the Ashtanga, it was much more of a flow, right? And and it didn't stop. That's more like Mr. Pilates. So there's differences, and there's different ways to address and deal with the nervous system. Mr. Pilates, it worked because, it worked on him and his clients, and he did it for decades, and he got results. That doesn't mean there's only one way to work with the nervous system. The nervous system has many different inputs and responses, and we can work with those. And again, so I in my practice in PT, I do a lot of static stretching in specific relationships, but I use them in patterns that are similar to what Mr. Pilates does. And then when you look at what other people who are doing things, whether it's in yoga, or when I was 17, I didn't know what is Pilates. Okay. Well, when I was 17, I didn't know what was Pilates either. I didn't know what was Pilates until I was, let me think about this, 25 or 26 is when I first learned about Pilates. So that's definitely, and that was a long time ago, 40 some years. So, he was ahead of his time in many ways, but he also borrowed from many people before him, and it's how we put everything together. So now you're 19, so you're still young. Okay, well, you still have lots to learn, and I'm still learning. I still learn more about what Mr. Pilates did almost every week. I keep studying it, and that's how I learn it. Because when you look at a person who spends his whole life, pretty much dealing with a certain subject, which is contrology, and how and all the things that he did in between, you're not going to get it in a weekend or a year or 10 years. Maybe after 10 years you start to get it. First, I heard about Calinetics by Calkin Piccini. I don't know who that is. I know calisthenics, which was before Mr. Pilates as well. And calisthenics, when you had the gymnastics or exercise in the early 1800s, that was all apparatus, and it was mostly for men. And what happened is they started to develop exercise for women, and it was non-apparatus, and that was called calisthenics. So it was something that that came later, right? And that's also again from the 1800s. And again, it was during Mr. Joe's Pilates time, and calisthenics was all non-apparatus. It was a lot of standing. Well, Mr. Pilates has standing work. A lot of the exercises that were non-apparatus were standing exercises, and there's plenty of old exercise books from the 1800s, early 1900s. Before Mr. Pilates put together Return to Life in 45, right? There was things very similar to that as well. So there's lots. God didn't come down and go poof, and all of a sudden Joe just knew everything. He had an extensive library. He read a lot of different things. He understood a lot of different stuff. And he he imitated quite a few, especially in the beginning, and then he started to go his own way. But in the beginning, he didn't always teach contrology. When he taught jujitsu, he taught self-defense, which was similar. He taught many different things, things that were popular at the time. Okay, so something to think about. All right, so yes, Mr. Pilates. When my teacher was Romana. And Romana was, a ballerina, and then she was a ballet teacher. So but she taught pretty much the dynamic stretch. And, and in ballet, there tends to be static as well. They'll do that static stretching to try to increase their range of motion, especially if they don't have the structure for it. They try to force it, and that's why they end up with a lot of problems. But when she taught Pilates, because one of the things she's always said was that it undoes what the dancing does, and that's why dancers went to Joe, to undo what the dancing did to them. So part of that was to find that reuse of the nervous system, and which is the reuse of the muscular system, because if you cut the nerve, the muscles don't do anything. So the muscles work related to what the nervous system provides the information for them to do. Okay. How do you think nowadays Pilates and the apparatus are different? Well, from Joe, it depends on the school, right, or the manufacturer. There's, people have made many, many, many changes in exercise and apparatus and different things. So, and is that Pilates? It's based on it. It's related to it, but it's not what Mr. Pilates taught. And again, I've talked about this before. Mr. Pilates had a principle. Right? People talk about the 6 principles, which were not from Mr. Pilates. That was Gail Eisen and Philip Friedman in the 1980s, who were students of Romana. And she approved it. And so we put that into the training manual, which was the first classical training manual, because classical is based on Romana. And the manual we put together, that was in the very beginning, was the 6 principles. So that was something she wanted and agreed with, so that was there, but it wasn't developed by Mr. Pilates. Mr. Pilates' basic principle was do the exercises the way I say to do it, and that's pretty much it. I'm paraphrasing, but it's basically that's what he said. And so, and if you change the apparatus, you change the exercise. And if you change, and today in social media, everybody's doing anything and calling it Pilates, so that's not, so what's different? It's a lot different, because what's the purpose behind that exercise? Mr. Pilates had purpose, had reason. There's a system, and it progressed, and you followed, an order, and you did certain things. And when you do that, the body changes the way that he says it changes. So if that's what, so if you go, well, Mr. Pilates said this, but you're doing different exercises, different apparatus, you may not get the same changes. Something to think about. And I'm not saying that contemporary is bad. Any exercise is better than no exercise, especially for humans, because we need exercise, especially as we get older. And in our society today, which is a sitting society, which is a very non-physical society in most places. I mean, it's not everywhere, but a large part of the population. So everybody needs to exercise. The question is that exercise healthful, right? Because exercise is movement, and you can do all sorts of crazy. There's millions of ways to do lots of different movements. Which are the most efficient? Which are the most effective? Which gives you the most benefit? Which can you do for a lifetime? All these different things. And Pilates, in 40 years, I can see if you do it progressively and slowly, and you follow this order and you follow the function, it can last a lifetime. So it's something to think about. Because when you look at the people who do the extreme bodybuilding, how many do that until their 80s? They do it usually when they're much younger. So, okay, so that's something to think about. All right. So that's it for today. Just, again, talking about stretching. There's lots more to it. I mean, when you look at the muscle physiology and you look at the relationship of muscle and the nervous system, the motor units, I mean, there's so much more to it. But the basic understanding is Mr. Pilates taught stretching. It was dynamic. And, and a lot of the movements are related to stretching from the brain all the way to the tips of the fingers and the tips of the toes, and a flexion, extension, side bending, rotation combinations. Those are the things that when you do that and you do the full workout, you have the mobility of the nervous system and the muscular system integrated so that you can do just about any function life throws at you. And that's, what Mr. Pilates and his system was about, being able to deal with life. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining. And again, if you have questions, DM me at the Pilates Museum Instagram, and I will add it to the list. And every Friday I do at 1:00, I'll do my AMAPs, and I will start at, I can look at your questions and we'll, I try to answer as best I can, and again, it can be in basic, it can be in anatomy, it can be physiology, it can be ergonomics, biomechanics, apparatus, business, any of those things. I've been doing this for, almost 40 years now, and I have some experience to be able to help answer questions, and I'm willing to, sit down and do this for, the community to help you guys out. A couple things. I teach a class every Tuesday, 2 classes at the moment. One is Balanceology, which is not Pilates. It came about because when I taught Pilates at Jacob's Pillow, like Mr. Pilates did, I've done it for 21 years. Again, you have an hour, and mat takes how long? Even advanced mats, 34 exercises. So and even when we add the standing work that he taught there as well, because we have information from documents that people made that wrote down the exercises when they were students there in the 40s. And so we have access to a lot of more information about what he truly taught there. So even when you add that, it's maybe about 40 minutes, and it's an hour. So one of the things that I added was some balance work afterwards, at the end of the class to make up for that hour. And so that's one of the things that I've done is added the balance work, and I call it Balanceology. And so I teach that every Tuesday at 12:30 on virtual, and you can go to my Linktree, Sean / Gallagher, and sign up there. And then at 1:00 I teach the resistor from the posters. There's 2 resistor posters. And we teach the arm springs and the leg springs and one neck strengthener from that series. And there's that poster, Mr. Pilates did photos. He put 2 bars up and he put the arm springs there, and he took photos of that, and that's what they used to make those posters. They're drawings that they made from him, pictures of him. If you want to follow along, I have those posters. I've made the 2 posters, but what I did, instead of the drawings that they had used, I took the picture of Mr. Pilates and made it into like a drawing, and now that's there. So it's like a drawing of Joe doing the exercises. So it's a unique, special way of doing things. And since they changed it, I wanted to change it back to Joe. So that poster is very specific. and it's copyrighted. So if there's something if you would like to join in and you want to take that, you can go to the Etsy store, the Pilates Source Etsy store, and it's called Pilates Posters. That's the name of the store, and they're both on there. You can get them, and then you can join in and follow along. So if that's something you're interested in, please do. All right. So that's it for today. Again, if you have questions, send them to me at the Pilates Museum Instagram page, and I will try to answer them and add it to the list. Okay? Thanks, everybody. Thanks for joining. Bye.